Montana Territory, 1878. The purple shadows of dusk settled over Willow Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling grasslands and the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. Dust swirled around the boots of Daniel Rutherford as he dismounted his bay, gelding in front of the modest cabin he called home. At 26, Daniel had already carved out a respectable cattle operation from the unforgiving land, but the light in his window reminded him of what truly kept his ranch running. Daniel believed firmly that a man's worth was measured by his independence, a conviction forged in the merciless frontier that had claimed his parents when he was just 15. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The only partnerships worth having were business arrangements, clean and uncomplicated. Anything else led to the kind of pain he'd witnessed in too many frontier tragedies. He stomped the trail dust from his boots before entering the warm, cinnamon-scented kitchen where Madeline Hayes moved gracefully between the wood stove and table. At 22, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a simple blue calico dress that had seen better days, she somehow managed to brighten the weathered interior of his bachelor homestead. "Evening, Mr. Rutherford," she said, placing a steaming plate of venison stew before him. "You're late today." "Fence line trouble," he muttered, eyeing the meal gratefully. "Looks like we got rustlers testing our boundaries again." Madeline had come to work as his cook 3 years prior, a desperate 17-year-old orphan with nowhere to go after her uncle's farm failed. What had started as temporary help had become something neither acknowledged, a partnership of sorts, though Daniel maintained strict boundaries between employer and employee. "I'll be heading into town tomorrow," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We're nearly out of flour and coffee." Daniel nodded, watching her move about the kitchen with practiced efficiency. What he wanted was straightforward: to build his ranch, expand his herd, and survive another Montana winter. He didn't need complications. He certainly didn't need the unwelcome warmth that spread through his chest when Madeline hummed softly while working, or the way his gaze lingered on her profile in the lamplight. What he refused to acknowledge was that what he truly needed was already under his roof, the companionship that made his house feel like something more than shelter, the gentle presence that eased the loneliness of frontier life. "Will you be needing anything else tonight, Mr. Rutherford?" she asked, preparing to retire to her small room off the kitchen. "No, Miss Hayes," he replied, the formality a shield against dangerous feelings. "That'll be all." As the door to her room closed, Daniel sat alone at the table, listening to the wind rattle the windows and wondering why success felt so hollow. Spring of 1879 arrived with unexpected fury. The creek that gave the settlement its name surged beyond its banks after 3 days of relentless rain, turning the land into a treacherous mire. Daniel had ridden out at dawn to check on stranded cattle when the shot rang out across the sodden landscape. He found 3 men attempting to drive off a dozen of his yearlings. The ensuing firefight left Daniel with a bullet graze across his ribs and his horse spooked into the distance. By the time he limped back to the ranch house, darkness had fallen and the rain had returned with vengeful force. Madeline flung open the door before his mud-covered boot hit the first porch step. "Daniel," she cried, forgetting formality at the sight of blood staining his shirt. It was the first time she'd called him by his given name in 3 years. "I'm fine," he insisted, though he leaned heavily against her as she helped him inside. "Just a scratch. Men always say that right before they drop dead from infection," she muttered, efficiently stripping away his soaked shirt. Her fingers worked methodically, cleaning his wound with practiced hands. "Where did you learn to dress a wound like this?" he asked through gritted teeth as she applied a stinging whiskey-soaked cloth. Madeline's eyes remained focused on her work. "My father was a doctor before he died in the war. I used to assist him." She glanced up briefly, her blue eyes meeting his. "There's a lot about me you've never asked, Mr. Rutherford." The intimacy of her ministrations, her warm hands against his bare skin, the concerned furrow of her brow, challenged everything Daniel believed about keeping people at arm's length. Her competence in crisis revealed dimensions to her character he'd deliberately ignored. "You should rest," she said finally, her voice soft as she finished bandaging him. "I'll keep watch tonight in case those rustlers come back." "With what?" Daniel asked, suddenly aware that in 3 years he'd never considered her protection. In answer, she reached behind the flour bin and produced a well-maintained Winchester repeating rifle. I'm not just good at baking biscuits, Mr. Rutherford. The revelation staggered him more than blood loss. Here was this woman he'd reduced to the cook in his mind, yet she stood before him capable of defending his home, their home, with the same determination with which she tackled everything else. I believe there's some explaining to do, Miss Hayes, he said, wincing as he leaned back in his chair. Perhaps, she replied with a small smile, but it can wait until morning. You need sleep. That night changed everything. As spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, something tentative grew between them as well. The strict formality began to fade. Conversations lingered past supper. Daniel found reasons to delay his evening rounds just to hear Madeline recount stories of her childhood in Missouri before the war claimed her father and illness took her mother. Why did you never tell me you were educated? Daniel asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching summer lightning dance across distant hills. You hired a cook, not a scholar, she replied simply. And frontier men don't typically value women for their minds. Her candor stung with truth. I've underestimated you, he admitted. Most people do, she said without bitterness. It's served me well at times. The admission opened floodgates of conversation. Daniel discovered Madeline had taught school briefly before her uncle brought her west. She could quote Shakespeare from memory and calculate complex figures faster than the bank clerk in town. She'd been surviving on her own terms just as he had, yet somehow had retained a warmth he'd surrendered to frontier practicality. When Founders' Day celebrations came in July, the entire settlement gathered for rare socializing. Daniel found himself watching Madeline as she laughed with other young women, her hair for once loosened from its practical bun, golden in the sunlight. Several unmarried ranchers vied for her attention, and an unfamiliar feeling twisted in Daniel's gut. Your cook seems popular, observed Sheriff Thomas Wilson, following Daniel's gaze. She's more than. Daniel stopped himself. More than what? A cook? An employee? The woman who had somehow become the center of his carefully constructed world? Better stake your claim, son, the sheriff continued with knowing eyes. Pretty young woman like that won't wait forever, especially one who can shoot straight and cook like an angel. It's not like that, Daniel protested weakly. Sure it ain't, the sheriff chuckled. That's why you're glaring daggers at poor Peterson for offering her lemonade. The observation haunted Daniel through the festivities. He'd built his life around self-reliance, yet he'd become dependent on Madeline's presence in ways that terrified him. Worse, he'd taken her for granted, never considering she might want more than he offered, a fair wage and a roof. When a group of musicians struck up a lively tune, young couples formed sets for dancing. Daniel watched as Robert Carson, a prosperous sheep rancher, approached Madeline with an outstretched hand. Before he could stop himself, Daniel was crossing the clearing. Miss Hayes, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. I believe you promised me this dance. Surprise flickered across her face. They both knew no such promise existed, but she smiled apologetically at Carson and placed her hand in Daniel's. I don't actually know how to dance, Daniel admitted quietly as he led her toward the other couples. Then why did you ask me? She whispered back. His eyes met hers directly. Because I couldn't bear watching you dance with someone else. The admission hung between them, more intimate than the dance that followed, her patient guidance of his awkward steps, her small hand warm in his larger one. Something fundamental shifted in that dusty clearing under summer stars. The careful barriers Daniel had maintained began to crumble. As summer faded to autumn, their relationship evolved into something undefined yet undeniable. They worked side by side preparing for winter, canning, smoking meat, mending. Their conversations deepened, yet Daniel still held back the words burning in his throat, fearful of disrupting the fragile balance. October brought the first snow, and with it unexpected visitors. A wagon carrying James Porter, his wife, and 3 children broke an axle 2 miles from Daniel's ranch. With mountain passes already treacherous and the nearest town a full day's journey, Daniel offered them shelter until repairs could be made. Watching Madeline with the Porter children awaken yearnings Daniel had refused to acknowledge. She taught them games, told stories, and managed to create special treats from limited winter stores. In quiet moments, he caught her watching the family with unmistakable longing. You're good with them, he said that night after the Porters had retired to the barn, converted to temporary quarters. I always wanted children, she admitted softly, staring into the fire. A family. The unspoken hung heavy between them. She was 23 now, passing her prime marriage years cooking for a man who offered her nothing but wages. Madeline, he began, her given name still unfamiliar on his tongue. It's late, she interrupted, rising quickly. Good night, Mr. Rutherford. The return to formality stung. Something was slipping away, and Daniel didn't know how to stop it. The porters departed 3 days later, leaving behind a strange emptiness and tension that stretched through November. Daniel caught Madeline writing letters in the evenings, but she never mentioned their contents. Her smiles became less frequent, her conversation more guarded. The revelation came with the first blizzard of December. Cut off from town by waist-high snowdrifts, Daniel was checking supplies in the root cellar when he discovered a carpet bag hidden behind preserved vegetables. Curiosity overwhelmed propriety, and he found neatly folded dresses, personal items, and letters addressed to Miss Hayes in Bozeman. Confronting her that evening was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. "You're leaving," he said simply, no accusation in his voice, only a hollowness that frightened him. Madeline didn't deny it. "When spring comes," she confirmed. "I've accepted a teaching position in Bozeman." "Why?" The question contained multitudes. "Because I can't be just your cook anymore, Daniel." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "I've spent 3 years waiting for you to see me as something more than a convenient household arrangement. Madeline, I know you care for me," she continued, her voice strengthening. "And I know you're terrified of that fact. But I'm 23 years old. I want a life, a husband, children, a home where I'm more than an employee." The truth hit Daniel like physical pain. He'd been hiding behind practicality, convincing himself that keeping her at a distance was protection when it was really cowardice. "What if I asked you to stay?" he managed. "As what?" she challenged. The question hung between them, unanswered. Daniel retreated to the barn, the cold somehow less biting than the truth he faced. Christmas arrived with another blizzard, trapping them in domestic intimacy that was both sweet torture and revelation. They exchanged modest gifts, hand-carved wooden hairpins from him, a knitted scarf from her. The simplicity belied the complexity of emotions neither fully expressed. New Year's Eve found them staring into the fire, the howling wind their only companion as 1879 prepared to give way to 1880. "My parents died on New Year's," Daniel said suddenly, breaking hours of silence. "A dispute over water rights. I was 15. Madeline said nothing, simply reached across the space between their chairs to take his hand. "I decided then that attachments were dangerous," he continued. "That independence was the only safety in this territory. And now," she asked softly, "now I realize being alone isn't the same as being safe," he admitted. "It's just being alone." The confession should have brought relief, but February brought catastrophe. Daniel returned from checking cattle in distant pastures to find the ranch house silent. The fire burned low. He called for Madeline, panic rising when no answer came. He found the note on the kitchen table, the handwriting unfamiliar and crude. "Rutherford, we have your woman. Bring $5,000 to Blackwater Canyon by sunset tomorrow, or she dies." The rustlers from spring had returned, but this time they'd taken something far more precious than cattle. With terror clawing at his throat, Daniel rode to neighboring ranches, gathering men willing to help. By morning, 8 riders prepared to rescue Madeline from the notorious Trent gang, outlaws who had terrorized 3 territories. Sheriff Wilson laid out the brutal truth. "The Trents don't leave witnesses, Daniel. They never intended to release her, money or not." The knowledge crystallized everything. Daniel had lost his parents to frontier violence. He'd built walls to prevent such pain again. Yet in protecting himself, he'd risked losing Madeline without ever telling her the truth. That somewhere between morning coffee and evening conversations, between fence mending and quiet reading by lamplight, she had become his heart. They found the gang's hideout at noon, a forgotten miner's cabin tucked into Blackwater Canyon. 4 men guarded the approach while, through a grimy window, Daniel caught a glimpse of Madeline, bound but alive, her face showing defiance rather than fear. The ensuing gunfight erupted with terrible swiftness. Bullets splintered wood and ricocheted off rocks as Daniel and the posse pressed their advantage of surprise. When a stray shot ignited a powder keg within the cabin, the explosion rocked the canyon. "Madeline!" Daniel's anguished cry tore from his throat as flames engulfed the structure. Without hesitation, he charged toward the burning building, deaf to warnings from his companions. Smoke blinded him as he kicked through the door. Coughing, eyes streaming, he followed the sound of desperate movement to where Madeline struggled against ropes binding her to a support beam. "I knew you'd come," she gasped as he cut her free, her faith in him a revelation even in this desperate moment. They barely escaped as the roof collapsed, Daniel carrying Madeline across burning debris and out into the snow-covered canyon. When they reached safety, he couldn't bring himself to release her, holding her against him as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair. "You can't lose something you don't claim," she replied, her voice hoarse from smoke but her eyes clear as they met his. In that moment, with death so narrowly avoided, the truth Daniel had fought for years became undeniable. "I love you," he said simply. "I have for a long time." Her smile was radiant despite soot-stained cheeks. "I know." They married 2 weeks later in the town's small church, Madeline in a borrowed dress and Daniel in his only suit, Sheriff Wilson standing as witness. The settlement turned out to celebrate, unsurprised by the union everyone had seen coming long before the principals involved. That night, as snow fell gently outside their bedroom window, Daniel traced the curve of his wife's cheek with wonder. "What changed?" she asked softly. "What finally made you brave enough?" "I realized something when I thought I might lose you," he said. "The frontier takes enough without us denying ourselves happiness out of fear. My parents wouldn't want me to live half a life." Spring 1880 arrived with renewal. Daniel added rooms to their home, a proper study for Madeline's books, space for children they hoped would come. The neighboring ranchers' wives, who had always treated Madeline with the awkward courtesy extended to a woman of uncertain position, now welcomed her fully into their circle. On their first anniversary, Daniel presented Madeline with a hand-carved sign for their ranch gate, "Rutherford and Rutherford. Partners," he explained as she traced the letters. "In everything. It took you long enough," she teased, eyes bright with happy tears. 3 years of cooking your meals before you figured out I was more than your employee." "I'm a slow learner," he admitted, pulling her close. "But I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time." As summer stretched golden across their expanding ranch, Madeline's suspected pregnancy was confirmed. Daniel's joy knew no bounds as he planned expansions to their home and future. The man who once believed safety lay in isolation now found his greatest strength in the family he was building. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat on their porch, Madeline's hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "Spending those years just as my cook when you could have had so much more?" "I was never just your cook," she replied with the wisdom that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "I was always waiting for you to catch up to what I already knew. That home isn't a place. It's the people who make living worthwhile." As twilight painted the Montana sky in impossible colors, Daniel Rutherford, once determined to need no one, held his wife's hand and watched the future approach with open arms, no longer afraid of what he might lose, but grateful beyond words for what he'd finally allowed himself to gain.